Hello, this is John Roth, speaking to you now from my office at Goshen College. In the last mini-lecture I offered a brief description of how a medieval peasant might have looked at the world. Today I want to give a few words about how an educated person, a university-trained professor in the Middle Ages might have understood the world. And this is a philosophy often described as scholasticism. The scholastics were Christian theologians and philosophers who in the late Middle Ages tried to make sense of their world by using the gift of reason. They assumed that reason could lead one on a path to God. I want to describe scholasticism probably too generally, but simply by identifying four characteristics. The first characteristic of the scholastics was a great reliance on authorities. The assumption in the Middle Ages was that most of what needed to be known was already described in the books and texts of the past. And so the goal of a medieval scholastic was not necessarily to introduce new knowledge, but to deepen one's understanding of what was already there. And so that meant that there was a great respect or reliance on authorities from the past. That's where the word author comes from. An author is somebody who has written a text, and the assumption of medieval scholastics was that if a text existed, if it had been written in the past, it must be authoritative. And so for example, the writings of Scripture, of course, obviously had an authority. The writings of the Church Fathers from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century were authoritative. And again, the assumption wasn't that you should improve on knowledge or that you could bring new insights to bear. Your task as a scholar was to master what had already been established as authoritative because it had been written down by an author. Another tendency of scholastics closely related to this was an interest in synthesizing and pulling together various bits and pieces of knowledge and pulling them together into compendiums. The best example of this, a text that I want you to do some reading in the next assignment, comes from the greatest of the medieval scholastics, a man named Thomas Aquinas. And in 1215, Aquinas published the first of, actually never completed it, but he published the first installment of his masterwork, a book called the Summa Theologica, which was the sum of everything there was to say about reality itself, which he described as theology. Since God created the whole earth, his description of the whole earth was inevitably a description of God, and the Summa Theologia began with a description of the most basic things like rocks and minerals, and then he built up to begin to describe plants and animals and the relationship of plants and animals to earth, the role of water and fire and wind, these basic elements of life. And then Aquinas moved to humans to describe humans made in the image of God and human interaction with God and with each other and with creation. And then he moved up to describe the angels and everything there was to describe about celestial beings. And finally, at the pinnacle of the Summa Theologia, the summary of everything there is to be said, Aquinas described the nature of God, that and how all of creation was interrelated in some way. All of creation ultimately pointed to the presence of God. And again, Aquinas' goal was not like modern scientists, that is to press out and uncover new knowledge. Aquinas' goal was to describe in great detail what was already there, what everyone already knew. Which leads me to a third characteristic of scholastic thinking, and that is a way of reasoning that is often called deductive reasoning. This will be important because I want to contrast it when we come to the Renaissance with inductive thinking, which is more characteristic of modern ways of thought. Deductive thinking begins with what we already know and then looks for evidence to defend what we already know. And so if you're thinking about theology, or say a preacher, if you're going to preach in a deductive style, you begin by asserting the known truths of theology. So you might begin your sermon by saying God is love. We know that to be true. It's already well established. God is love. And then you go to Scripture to find evidence, wherever you can find it, to demonstrate, to give evidence of the love of God. But you start with an established truth, and then you look for evidence to support it. That's deductive reasoning, and it's a very typical approach of medieval scholastics. Again, keep in mind how different that is from inductive reasoning that says, no, we start by assuming we don't know anything, and then we build up from the evidence to a conclusion down the road. Deductive reasoning, medieval scholasticism, says we start with what we know, the truths that have been established by authorities, that are written into the book of nature that we see as evidence of God all around us, and then we look for the particular evidence to prove it, to give it more, to anchor it more fully. A final characteristic of medieval scholasticism is something called the dialectic method, or in technical terms it's called syllogistic logic. And this is an approach to arguing that begins with a general principle and then moves from the general principle to a specific conclusion. The classic example of this is that you would start with a general claim: all human beings are mortal. We all are going to die. Can't disagree with that. That's the general premise. And then you move from that general premise to a more specific application. You say, for example, I, John, I am a human being. Well, that's true too. And then you move from that secondary conclusion to the outcome, which is, I, John Roth, am going to die. I am immortal. You start with the general, all humans are mortal. You move to the more particular, John is a human, and out of that we conclude that John is mortal. John is going to die. Now that might seem like an obvious, maybe even completely irrelevant argument to make. Well, yes, okay, this is a mathematical principle. You know, if A equals B, B equals C, A equals C, we know these kind of logical relationships. And yet, in the Middle Ages, the ability to reason with logic proved to be a very significant lever for making general claims about the nature of the universe. And in the reading I want you to do from Thomas Aquinas, where he demonstrates a proof for the existence of God using reason and using syllogistic logic, I think you'll see why this kind of an approach was exciting. It was exhilarating as a way of making conclusive arguments about the nature of reality. So medieval scholasticism relies on authority, an impulse to synthesize, and a deductive approach to reason, and the use of syllogistic logic. We'll see how this plays out in the reading that you're about to do from Aristotle.